Welcome to a very special episode of A Moment in History. I'm your host, 𝙎𝙐𝘽𝙎𝘾. And if you've followed our program for some time, you know that A Moment in History explores significant events in history in bite-sized chunks. However, to rightly study history, we need to capture the whole story. We need to see how these different moments come together to create a larger story. This special Moment in History full-length program will feature several past shorter episodes, and throughout the program, you and I will journey together to discover the grand story of what happened. We're going to study a topic that I consider one of the most interesting in world history. It is the medieval Crusades, the series of epic wars between the Christian Crusaders and the Muslim Turks for control of the Holy Land. Both faiths claimed ownership of the lands surrounding the all-important city of Jerusalem. Now, Muslims believed that this was where their prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven, and obviously, as Christians, Jerusalem carries great weight for us as well. It was the capital city of the people of God, and it was also where our Lord Jesus suffered and died on the cross for our sins. Now, for 200 years in the High Middle Ages, Christian knights battled with Muslim warlords for supreme control of Palestine. It's a clash of worldviews during an age of bloodshed, and it's a religious war where both sides believed that God was on their side. As a lover of history, what more could you want? So let's go back together and discover the fascinating true story of the Crusades. But first, let's look at some background. In 1095 AD, Pope Urban II issued a call across Europe to take up arms to free the Holy Lands from the Muslim Turks, who had taken control of the Holy Lands several hundred years before. An army of thousands of crusaders trekked across Europe and captured Jerusalem in 1099, establishing the Christian Kingdom of Jerusalem. Though they now controlled Jerusalem, the passage for Christian pilgrims to the Holy City was very dangerous, with Islamic brigands who were notorious for killing travelers. Out of this need was born the first and greatest of the Crusader-era military orders, the Knights Templar. Named after the location of their foundation at the Temple Mount in Old City, Jerusalem, the order was created to be a unique blend of fierce warrior and pious monk. Founded by French knight Hugh of Payens in 1119, the order's main purpose was to protect Christian pilgrims traveling in the Holy Land through heavily occupied Muslim country. In 1129, the order was institutionalized and recognized by the Catholic Church at the Council of Troyes. The Knights Templar were set apart from the pious and often prideful medieval knights that existed during this time. Upon entrance into the order, they would take vows of chastity, poverty, and most importantly, the vow to defend the Holy Land and the Holy City from Islamic pagans. One could argue that the Kingdom of Jerusalem survived for as long as it did because of the presence of the Templars. They would prove to be the most formidable offensive weapon against the Turks in Palestine, but they could not ultimately hold on to the Holy Land. At virtually every major Christian defeat in Palestine during the Crusades, the Templars were there. They were there when the Christians lost Jerusalem and a piece of the alleged true cross of Christ in 1187, and they were there 100 years later when the last Christian stronghold in the Holy Land, Acre, was destroyed by the Mamluks. Disgraced, the Templars returned to Europe. They had established one of the most lucrative medieval banking networks in the world, and through this, the order became lavishly wealthy. At the same time, rumors had been swirling throughout the Crusades that the brothers in the order were perhaps not the pious monks they claimed to be. Allegations of homosexuality and paganism were hurled at the Templars. History tells us very little if these things were true, partially because of the secrecy of the order. These things did give French King Philip the Fair a perfect opportunity to strike. He ordered the mass arrest and execution of the brothers in the order in 1307 in France, charging them with breaking their vows and committing vile acts of sodomy. The Templars were excommunicated and many of them executed, culminating with the execution of their last Grand Master, James of Molay, in 1314. We don't know what happened to the fate of the Templars. Some say a group of them escaped the mass execution and went to Scotland, while others say they traveled to the New World and took on a new name, the Freemasons. We will never know. But either way, this band of warrior monks will go down as one of the most epic military orders in the world. the Templars were a mighty order, and for the first several decades after their formation, they did their job well. But Islam, driven to the shadows after a defeat at Jerusalem, was rebuilding. In the 1140s, the Muslims regrouped and took back the county of Edessa near Jerusalem. Not many years later, a new Muslim warrior rose to power to lead the forces of Islam against the Christians. This, of course, was Saladin, Sultan of the 𝙎𝙬𝘽𝙎𝘾 dynasty. Let's explore the next stop in our story, the Battle of Hattin in 1187. This was the true turning point of the Crusades and of Christian dominance in Jerusalem. Now let's recap the story so far. In 1099, an army of several thousand Christian knights took the city of Jerusalem from the Muslim Turks who had ruled it for over 400 years. The Franks, and by the way, that's just another name for the Western Christians, established the Christian kingdom of Jerusalem upon their capture of the city, and since the end of the 11th century, the Holy City had been the epicenter of Christian dominance in the Holy Lands. But in the late 1140s, the Muslims struck back, taking the county of Edessa and several other lands and preparing for a recapture of Jerusalem. Over the next several decades, a Muslim leader would arise to unite the largely divided Muslim tribes against the Christians to retake Jerusalem. His name was Saladin, Sultan of Egypt and Syria and leader of the 𝙎𝙬𝘽𝙎𝘾 dynasty. In July of 1187, the Battle of Hattin took place. The Muslims won a brutal victory at the expense of the Christians at Hattin, which, by the way, is a valley between two mountains near the banks of the Sea of Galilee. Thanks to some incredibly effective archers and Saladin's brilliance on the battlefield, the Muslims decimated the Christians. An added loss for the Christians was that Saladin led the famous capture of a relic, a supposed piece of the true cross of Christ, which the Christians took with them into battle in hopes it could generate divine victory. The loss was devastating, and 2 months later, Saladin led the recapture of Jerusalem from the Christians. This devastation lit a new crusading fire in Europe, and several medieval kings launched a third crusade to retake the city, including Saladin's legendary rival, Richard the Lionheart of England. Richard recaptured much of the land lost to the Muslims, but he could not retake Jerusalem, nor could any other crusader after him. The Crusades ended 100 years later in Christian defeat at Acre in 1291. The Battle of Hattin was a brutal loss for the Christians. If not for Richard the Lionheart, this could have ended the Crusades decades early. But Richard led a mighty army of English knights to recapture a large portion of the Holy Lands that had been lost under Saladin. These two men had great respect for one another, and there's an interesting legend that developed in the Middle Ages. Legend has it that Saladin once granted Richard a kingly gift of 2 horses for his respect for the English king on the field of battle. Now, historians tend to mark the loss of Jerusalem as the beginning of the end for the Crusaders, but the war raged on for another 100 years. The powers in Christendom called for a 4th crusade in 1202, but the Christian knights made a baffling decision on the way to the Holy Lands. Instead of narrowing in on Islam, as was the original plan, the Western Christians made a sharp turn and headed for Constantinople, the capital city of the Byzantine Empire. Now, please don't miss this. The Byzantines were fellow Christians. The Crusaders attacked their fellow Christians and conquered the city of Constantinople in 1204, establishing the short-lasting Latin kingdom of Constantinople. It only lasted until 1261 when the Byzantines retook their capital city and re-established the Byzantine Empire. Now you can see at this point in history, crusading zeal in the West is starting to wane. There were several other commissioned crusades, including one orchestrated by Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire, who was a contemporary of St. Francis of Assisi. Frederick won back the city of Jerusalem briefly through a rare peace treaty with the Muslim Sultan al-Kamil in the late 1220s. This was a great win through negotiation, but it was of little significance as the Muslims just retook the city in the 1240s with very little resistance. Finally, after several other failed crusades, the Kingdom of Jerusalem had dwindled down to the capital city of Acre, several hundred miles up the Mediterranean coast from Jerusalem. In the final battle for the Holy Lands, the Mamluk Turks went up against an army mainly consisting of Knights Templar at Acre, as we just learned, and drove the Christians from the city and from the region. In 1291, the last Christian outpost in the Middle East fell to Muslim forces. Let's explore this end of the Crusades in the dramatic fall of the city of Acre in 1291. To understand the significance behind this collapse, let's explore the story of the Crusades up until this point. Since 1095, Christian and Muslim armies had been locked in a bloody struggle over the Holy Lands, the small strip of land along the Mediterranean eastern coast surrounding the famous city of Jerusalem. Both faiths claimed the city as their own. Muslims believed it was the place in which their prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven. And as Christians, we know that Jerusalem is the place where the Lord Jesus Christ was crucified, dead, and buried, and then rose again 3 days later. Religion was the driving force behind this bloody clash. From 1099 to 1187, the Christians held Jerusalem and the surrounding regions. But in 1187, the Muslim forces under the mighty Sultan Saladin recaptured Jerusalem. After several epic battles between Saladin's Turkish forces and King Richard the Lionheart's English army, the Christians regained much of the land they lost, but they could not recapture the capital city of Jerusalem. As such, they moved their capital city roughly 100 miles up the coast to the city of Acre. Acre would remain the Christian stronghold in the Holy Lands for the next 100 years. To the detriment of the Christians, the loss of Jerusalem was really the beginning of the end in the Crusades. The Catholic Church commissioned several more crusades throughout the 13th century, but none of them accomplished the goal of regaining the Holy City. A brief peace treaty between Ayyubid Sultan al-Kamil and Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II put Jerusalem back in Christian hands in the 1230s, but the Christians lost the city in 1244 and never regained it. They lost Antioch and Jaffa in the next several decades. Now, perhaps it was a weakening of the crusading spirit or a distinct home field advantage for the Turks, who were used to the extreme climate of the Middle Eastern deserts. But by the late 13th century, the Christian presence in Jerusalem was next to nothing. Christendom held on by a thread to Acre, the last remaining outpost of the once mighty Christian kingdom of Jerusalem, until the spring of 1291. In April of 1291, the Mamluk Turks laid siege on Acre, in which a Crusader army made up prominently of Knights of the Temple of Solomon, or Knights Templar, was charged to defend it. The Mamluks broke through the city gates in May and overcame the severely outnumbered Templars. The Christians lost Acre and the Holy Lands to the Muslims, thus putting an end to the epic medieval war known throughout history as the Crusades. Yes, this was the end of the Crusades in the Holy Lands, but it would not be the end of the Crusades. I think you can agree that for the Christians, the Holy Land conflict was largely a failure. The Christians could not keep Jerusalem, and they ended up being driven from the Holy Lands altogether at the end of the 13th century. But there was another sphere of the Crusades, what we can call the Western theater. Now, since the early medieval period, roughly the 8th century AD, Muslims had occupied the lands of Spain and Portugal. But the Christians began to fight back, and unlike their fellow knights in the East, they succeeded. Let's take a look at this largely forgotten theater of the Crusades, the battle for Iberia. Iberia was once the westernmost point of the Roman Empire and the very edge of the known world. The Apostle Paul planned to visit Spain on a missionary journey, but never made it there before his beheading in the 60s AD. When the empire was Christianized in the 4th century, the lands of Spain became the westernmost stronghold of Christendom. But in the early 8th century, a new religion invaded the region. In the year 711 AD, the Islamic forces under General Tariq bin Ziyad crossed the Strait of Gibraltar from Africa and drove out the resident Visigoths, ancient Germanic tribes who rivaled the Romans and had become largely Christianized in the previous centuries. From there, the Muslim Umayyad dynasty was established. Some historians call this period a golden age of religious acceptance among the three dominant faiths in Spain, which at the time were Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, but the truth is perhaps more sinister. Christians and Jews lived as second-class citizens in Muslim-dominated Spain. And as early as the late 8th century AD, Spanish Christians began the campaign to return Spain to Christian rule. They called it the Reconquista. For the next 700 years, the Spanish Christian kingdoms began to expand from north to south. Now, this battle is fascinating for two reasons. First of all, its length. This battle lasted roughly 700 years, most of the duration of the medieval period. Spanish Christians and Muslims fought for control of Spain during that entire time. Second, the outcome. While the Christians in the Middle East failed to conquer the Muslims and were ultimately driven from the Holy Lands in 1291, the Christians in the West succeeded. By the end of the 13th century, roughly 3/4 of the Iberian Peninsula was Christianized. This brings us to one of the most important years in world history, the year 1492. Several months before Christopher Columbus's historic journey to the New World, the Spanish kingdom under King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella forced the last of the Muslims in southern Spain to surrender, completing the 700-year Christian reconquest of Spain. The battle for Iberia takes our Crusader story all the way into the 14th and 15th centuries, a fact in history that many people miss. The Crusades, though officially over in 1291, actually continued well into the later Middle Ages. We looked earlier at the medieval order of knights that arose from the Crusades, the Knights Templar. Actually, there were three major orders of crusading knights during this era. The Knights of the Hospital of St. John, or Knights Hospitaller, were another order that was based in Jerusalem. Now, the third Crusader order was probably the least known, but it was incredibly fascinating, and this was the Teutonic Knights. They were mainly a fighting force like the Templars, but unlike the Templars, the Teutons focused their campaigns in Eastern Europe and the Baltic region. Now again, this should make us scratch our heads and raise our eyebrows. What were these Christians doing waging war against fellow Christians? Remember, Christianity had reached Eastern Europe by this time. In these regions, it was the 10th century AD, so many historians assume that these knights kind of just wanted power and control. They attempted to gain power over the region, but were stopped by a fierce unified kingdom in Poland in what historians remember as the Battle of Grunwald. The two chief players in this battle each have a fascinating backstory. The first were the Order of Teutonic Knights, a military religious order founded in Jerusalem during the Crusades at the end of the 12th century. Unlike the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, who mainly focused their efforts in the Holy Land and in Latin Europe, the Teutonic Knights were recommissioned to the Baltic region by the Catholic Church with the charge of converting the pagan Slavic tribes of Eastern Europe to Christianity. But at this point in history, much of Eastern Europe was already Christianized. This is where we meet the second players in the Battle of Grunwald, the Polish kingdom. Poland was Christianized in the 10th century AD, and several centuries later, in the late 1300s, the Kingdom of Poland merged with the small Duchy of Lithuania through marriage. In 1409, the powerful Teutonic Order declared war on this kingdom, even though they were already Christian. The Battle of Grunwald would prove to be the most important war of the Teutonic-Polish clash. Polish soldiers attacked the Teutonic stronghold near the town of Grunwald on July 15, 1410. The Teutons were outnumbered but still entered the fray, believing their superior discipline and skill on the field would be enough to overcome the Slavic tribesmen. After a failed attempt to use a cannon against the Polish knights, and remember, gunpowder was still a new technology in warfare at this time, and many cannons either misfired, backfired, or exploded in late medieval warfare, the Teutons successfully charged the Poles but were met with more manpower than they could handle. The Grand Master of the Order, Ulrich von 𝙎𝙬𝘽𝙎, was killed in the battle. Grunwald is still remembered as a day of celebration for Poland and Lithuania, but meanwhile, Grunwald marked the beginning of the end for the Teutonic Knights, who would never again hold the power they once did in Eastern Europe. Well, the 1400s would prove to be Christendom's last gasp of crusading zeal against the Muslims. And this was especially true with the rise of perhaps the most powerful Muslim empire in world history, the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans sacked and destroyed the Byzantine Empire in 1453 and stood on Western Christendom's front door, threatening to wipe out the entire civilization. If ever Western Christendom needed a crusade, perhaps now was the time. But by this time, most of Western Europe was utterly exhausted from years of bloodshed. And what is more, there were severe in-house issues that were plaguing Christendom at this time, mainly within the church. You see, the church was fraught with licentiousness and morally corrupt priests and bishops, and many theological falsehoods began to threaten the foundations of Christianity. Well, as it happened, there were some left in Christendom who were ready for a fight and wanted to conquer and destroy the invading Muslims once and for all. One such man was the brutal and legendary Prince of Wallachia, who became the historical martyr for the mythical figure of Dracula. This man, of course, was Vlad the Impaler. Let's explore the story of Prince Vlad Dracul of Transylvania. The mythical character Dracula, the famous vampire of the literary horror genre, finds its birth in this late medieval prince from Eastern Europe. The name Dracul, which history remembers as Prince Vlad's surname, is not actually a last name, but rather a derivative of the Latin word Draco, which means dragon. Vlad's father was a knight in the Order of the Dragon, a late medieval fraternity of Christian knights dedicated to defending Christendom from the Ottoman Turks who were lurking on Christendom's doorstep in Eastern Europe. Vlad would dedicate his life to the defense of Christendom as well, but in an utterly infamous way. Born in Transylvania in 1431, Vlad was a victim of the violent late medieval world in which he lived. As an 11-year-old boy, Vlad was taken as a prisoner of the Ottoman Sultan Murad II to ensure that his father, the Prince of Wallachia, would submit to Ottoman rule in the region. Vlad was released in 1448 after his father's assassination. He then embarked on a furious quest to recapture his father's position, a quest that lasted the remainder of his life. From these early horrors, Vlad became a ferocious military leader who did not shy away from brutally punishing his enemies. He became known throughout history as Vlad the Impaler for his practice of impaling his foes on high stakes after battles as a warning. One specific instance of this was in 1462, when he led a massacre of thousands of Ottoman Turks and left them impaled to intimidate those Ottomans who had caused him such trouble in his youth. Vlad and the Wallachians were instrumental in slowing down the oncoming tide of Turks into Christian Europe, but they could not stop it. He died in 1476, most likely in battle at the age of 45. The legends surrounding Vlad are many, including one that he drank the blood of his victims, most likely leading to the same characteristic found in horror vampires. No matter the truthfulness of these tales, one thing is certain: Vlad the Impaler left his mark on Western civilization as both a fierce warrior and a ruthless warlord. Vlad was ruthless, but he could not hold back the tide of Islam. The Turks reached the gates of Vienna, Austria in the early 16th century. Providentially, that was as far west as they got. The empire declined throughout the early modern world and finally collapsed at the end of World War I. We've come to the end of our program, and I hope you've learned something new about the Crusades, the medieval world, and the nature of religion in warfare. I'd like to encourage you, if you're watching this with your family or with your children, maybe to talk about some of what you've seen today. Were the Crusades justified in taking up the sword to defend Jerusalem? Or maybe another question, what is a biblical response to the Crusades? Should we as Christians be ashamed of them? Or should we be proud of them? Or should we be something in between? And maybe one more question, what are some passages from the Bible that bring truth and clarity to the story of the Crusades? Until next time, I'm 𝙎𝙬𝘎𝘎𝘎𝑃, and as always, thanks for joining me once again for a moment in history.